Hello everybody, welcome to part 2 of my ISD Mould King Monarch kind of hands-on and walk around and discussion. In this section of the video, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that were a little bit of a bad or not so bad in my case, and one little ugly thing that I do kind of feel pertains to this. So for my bads, which again are not too bad, and I think this is typical of a lot of these larger Star Destroyer builds, the gap at the front, as you build this thing, naturally some of these larger things are going to want to curve or expand slightly. That it wasn't that bad, but what I did end up doing just for my own sanity is I did actually add a couple of clear bands in there, which this is not the permanent. I'm actually going to redo these, but I'm using these just to ensure that there's not a large gap on the front at the very tip. So I would suggest doing that. I don't think it's anything that they do wrong. I think it's just the nature of these large scale brick builds. And in the case of this thing where it's 4 feet long, these sections are just so big and the connection points are internal. So you really just have to do what you can. It's not bad if you didn't use those, it would still be perfectly fine. But just for my own sanity, I did this. As I mentioned in the first video, the parts come to you and correspond to the instructions through these numbered bags that actually correspond to the sections of the instructions that you get. But as I mentioned, my one bad is that about halfway through, the numbers of the bags inside of these larger bags lose their numbers, or at least they did in my case. So it's not a horrible thing. It's just something to note that if you're building, don't start cracking open all these bags. Take your time and just work on these one at a time and you'll avoid any issues. So it's not really a bad thing. One of the areas that I guess I could say I had the most issues with is the engine section back here. A lot of amazing detail, but the problem you run into is as you begin to assemble the top and bottom sections to the structure, there's a lot of condensing and a lot of things start to collapse in on themselves. So the tolerances are very tight. And obviously these are Legos and they're only connected by a few studs in some cases. In the case of these two sections in particular, on both sides, the way the instructions have you build it, they're actually only held on by a single stud on each end. And based on how these things come together so tightly, there's a little bit of pressure. These could come off very easily, and they did get knocked off a couple times, and with my fat fingers trying to get in there, I had a heck of a time trying to get them back in place. So they could still stand to be a little bit more adjusted. So it's not a showstopper, it's just something to be aware of, and probably somebody with more nimble fingers won't even have an issue. Just be aware of that. And another area is part of the greebling on the back, as basically you have these large sections of long, and I apologize, I don't know the particular title of these specialty bricks, that use some of these levers as more accents. And the problem is they're in there by pressure, so obviously some of them can pop out if you're not careful, and just these long runs of these bricks, sometimes, as you can see here, some slight movement. You just have to be very cautious as you're building this and try not to overdo it, or at least every now and then just go back through it and continue to make small tweaks as you're doing it to avoid having any major issues. One other thing I did note, as I was building this, the back of the bridge has some great detail and greebling. The problem is if you follow the instructions, these two plain gray bricks that you see here aren't there. There's actually a hole there that never gets filled by a follow-on step. And it is possible I missed something, but looking back even at the pictures in that area, it shows this section, and then there's just a gap right here. And I don't know if that was intended or if perhaps a step was omitted, but it will work fine without those in there, but it was driving me crazy, even though nobody's going to see this once I put it on a shelf. So I went into the plethora of hundreds of leftover bricks and filled that in with just 2 bricks, and it fits perfectly. There's no major issues. But again, if for some reason you either didn't have those bricks or didn't want to change from the actual instructions, you could leave that gap and probably nobody but you would even know that they were there. So just keep that in mind. It's not a bad, but it is something that bothered me, as I mentioned in the first video. The smaller Rebel ships that are included have colored bricks to give that indication of actual, engines being operated. And I think that just gives that visual, impression of speed or movement. Whereas the Star Destroyer did not have any of that. It's just the gray bricks that you see in here. So I actually went online. I looked at how the UCS Star Destroyer does this on theirs, and I actually went ahead and purchased some additional bricks from Bricklink and tried to emulate that. So it's nothing fancy, and I'm sure there's folks that could do a lot better, but I just did that to give that overall impression of movement and energy. You don't need it, but it was just something that to me just made this even more, linked up with its accessory ships. And again, we seem to be focused just on the engines, but that's really where a majority of my little nitnoid problems were. The engines in this build are based, the large engines rather, are based on using the Death Star planet build, the old retired planet build sets that were done many years ago. The problem is, as you can even see here in this one, Mould King, for some reason, rather than using the bottom of this, which is pretty much an exact mirror image of this, but it doesn't have the actual weapon dish, for some reason they built it using the three of these, all using the weapon dish, and as you can see here, you have a dimple. And that drives me crazy. Nobody else will probably notice it. And if you were to show this to somebody, they probably wouldn't even notice it unless you pointed it out. But it drives me crazy. And to try to replace that on your own, I looked on Bricklink to try to see if I could buy three of those. Since they have been out of production for so long, you're talking anywhere from $6 to $20 a piece to get three of the bottom sections to do what these three are doing. And I just can't see, as much as I love this, a $289 set with, up to $60 in three pieces on the back of it. No, that made no sense to me, so I'm sticking with it as is. I did slightly turn them as much as I could to try to hide that a little bit. And I also feel that having those blue accent pieces added in there kind of also takes the eye away from all that gray. So I'm hoping that that'll also be a little bit of a distraction. So it's nothing that breaks it or causes this to be an issue. It's just a small little beauty mark, if you will, on the entire thing. One other thing, as I did mention, the other video, is some of the pictures in the instructions. While they are nice, they're greatly detailed, they highlight areas. Sometimes, based on the angles of the pictures, it's a little hard, especially if a part is located on the back edge of an image, to know exactly how it always connects. So it's not a showstopper. I never had something I couldn't figure out. I would usually just sneak ahead and look at things and figure out exactly what was intended by looking at a future step that usually showed the backside or a different angled view of that particular thing. So just something to keep in your mind as you're looking at that and to be careful of. Another thing is this has just so much greebling on it, as I showed previously. Just hundreds upon hundreds, if not thousands of pieces of detail. Be cautious, because while a lot of these are secured in very well and very snugly, every now and then you'll find a piece that might be a little bit loose in its fitting. For example, I was moving this slightly to get some better light on this for the video. I accidentally knocked this piece off. This whole little brick just kind of fell off, and I heard it hit the ground, and I had no idea where it came from. And just because of the sheer size and volume of bricks on here, depending on the size of what comes off, you might never figure out where it went. It took me almost an hour to realize that that little brick went right there. So just avoid my mistake and keep your sanity and just watch out and be cautious. But overall, there are not a lot of loose pieces that are just going to fall off on their own. You would have to actually really adjust or shake this thing to get something to come loose and pull off. And lastly, the only other thing that's a bad, but not too bad, and I apologize for my fingers in the video, I'm just having to hold this by hand. The Corellian Cruiser, this Corvette, it's good, and this is exactly what the problem is. This particular build of the three is back heavy. So if you shake it too much or you move it too much, it tends to fall back just because all of the weight is centered in the engine section. The other two are centered very well. This one even has two sections of transparent bricks to keep it upright, and it looks great. But this one here, the weight is just not distributed very well, and there's no place you could really shift this angle back without modifying this build to make it more sturdy. So my only thought is I can perhaps add a few more small bricks to the front, maybe detail out the bridge and the center section a little more, add a little bit of weight to hopefully avoid that, or just be very careful when I'm moving this thing around. When I get it to its final destination, it should be fairly sturdy. So again, those are really all the gripes I have. I'm calling them the good, bad, and ugly, but they're not bad so much as just, small gripes. The only ugly I have, and it is something I mentioned in the first video, is while I love this build, and I think Mould King did an excellent job with it, I do have concerns if the original MOC creator, which I truly believe this is based upon, is getting any reimbursement from Mould King. If they aren't, shame on them. If they are, kudos to them. But if they are, they're not letting anybody know. They're not referring anybody back to the original creator. And as far as I could tell on the original creator's page on Rebrickable, he doesn't really say much about this. So I have a feeling he's not getting reimbursed. So what I'm going to do is, now that I've bought this and I enjoyed building it, and honestly there was no way I could have afforded to build it with actual Legos using his instructions, I'm going to buy those instructions anyway, just because I feel that he did such a tremendous job, and that's what keeps a lot of these MOC creators doing these amazing kind of builds that really allow other folks to move on and do great things. So if you do buy this and decide to support him, or if you want to buy his instructions and try to build it using your inventory of Lego parts, or God forbid you wanted to try to buy all 12,000 parts on Bricklink, best of luck. The name of the MOC creator is ONECASE, ONECASE, and he's on Rebrickable, and you can buy the instructions. It's called the ISD Monarch, which actually is what Mould King calls it as well. And I would highly encourage looking at it, supporting him if you decide to, and giving him a shout out whenever possible. So I just felt I had to do that, just because I don't want somebody to not get the credit they deserve if that's the case. And the last final note, while this does come with 3 great ships, I also want to expand upon that. And what I'd like to do is actually make this look like more of a diorama, and perhaps actually have some other smaller ships either surrounding, maybe attacking, or attacking the rebel ships alongside. So there are on Rebrickable some instructions for scale micro builds that correspond to the Lego UCS Star Destroyer, which is honestly only a little bit smaller than this. So the scale is still very valid, and you could use them. And it's not these size ships just like this. There are a variety of other ships from both the original trilogy, the sequels, and the prequels. So you could do some pretty unique builds that would be in scale to this entire Star Destroyer, to include Y-Wings, some TIE bombers, and TIE fighter groups. Very, very tiny, so you're not going to get a huge amount of detail. But if you're trying to really make this stand out and have a nice display, I think they would be great. I'll try to include a link to those in the comments. But if you are looking them up on Rebrickable, look for this keyword that I have here in bold, 1:1455. That's the scale that those are built to. And if you do that, several users will pop up. There are free instructions, and they allow you to build a number of smaller ships that would look great with this in some type of display. So again, this has run on far too long. My voice is giving out, and I do apologize. But if there are any other questions I can answer, any concerns or ideas I brought up that you'd like clarification on, I'd be happy to answer them, take additional pictures, anything I could do to support us. If you have any questions, please feel free. I will also be putting up some small 1- and 2-minute videos that I took at the end of each section. So sections 1 through 22, which will actually show how this thing was built from start to finish, and may even give some better insight into some of the internal sections which are now no longer visible, some of the things I noticed, and the issues I might have come up with in each individual section. So thanks again for watching. Apologize for the length of the video, but it's a big video for a very, very big build. Again, have a great day, and if there's any questions, feel free to ask. Take care.